What do you think the kind of fallout was after Tesla Battery Day, when they talked about batteries with non-cobalt components? Did that sort of knock the cobalt industry, or was that so much discussed, or was it well understood well before then?
Look, I think I'll answer your question two ways. One, from the investment market, where there were those who weren't quite as fundamental, who saw it as a harbinger of all things to come. I would say this quite emphatically, that the Battery Day probably had 50 separate technical projects under its belt, and overwhelmingly the bulk of those were on the ability to make the car cheaper, and the capital required for those so-called Giga factories, or I think he used the word terra factory at one stage. So overwhelmingly was the production capacity to make the vehicles. Within the vehicle, the bill of materials, there was a number of initiatives. The battery gets obviously a disproportionate focus given its cost. One of those projects was to do with the high nickel elimination. I would say this to you, and it's clear not just Tesla but others that we deal with share a similar stratification of the EV market. There is a low-end market out there, passenger vehicle, commercial market, and it's predominantly Chinese-based, and it feeds off an LFP battery. So it's a non-nickel, non-cobalt battery. It's been in place for 20-odd years. The LFP is a Chinese formulation, and these are typically sub 200-mile range urban vehicles. They're tiny little box-like vehicles if you haven't seen them. Sticker price $5, $6, $7 US. And ultimately, when we get into ride share and all that robo stuff, it's probably a great platform for that. Overwhelmingly globally, and indeed in China itself, the mass market EVs, the passenger and the commercial vehicles, are all NCM, NCA, NMCA, or soon to be NMCA chemistry. So they're all cobalt nickel chemistries. They have a superior energy density of about 30% over the LFP. Yet even the most ardent supporters of the LFP in China concede that there's only about a 2 or 3% price difference at a pack level between the LFP and the 811. So there's really a tiny difference in cost. So that speaks to the fact that those LFP vehicles are built to a cost rather than to a standard, if you like. So overwhelmingly, mass market EVs, certainly ex-China, will be dominated by cobalt. The question is, what's the ultimate level? What's the battery standard in that chemistry? Today, we're still at a 532 broadly on an NMC. The 622 will get some pace in the next year or two, and then ultimately the 811 is the dream. But getting that right commercially is hard. There are some examples where that has gone wrong. So all OEMs will be very reticent, given you mentioned before the 200 or 300 billion the battery guys are putting in, the 500 billion that we've recently, a number of consultants are quoting for OEMs committing. Who's going to save 1 or 2% on those costs and endanger that capital spend by trying to leapfrog technologies which haven't been proven? So the 622 will happen. The 811, I've no doubt, will bed in ultimately. But by the time you make those vehicles go through the production runs, it's the end of the decade or longer before you have a credible threat to try and eke out that 1 or 2% cost saving. And that's what I think the key message for the market that didn't understand from the investor point of view is that there's some nice targets to reduce cost, and sure, cobalt is a small part of that overall cost equation. But the reality of stepping into that is so far away today. And just look at the progress those batteries have made in 3 years. Those high nickel batteries haven't really done more than come off the lab scale. In fact, they're still at the lab scale. So that's first point. Sorry, again, long-winded point. The investors don't understand that there's a inertia in the current system, and that won't be usurped by new technology in the near period. The other aspect I'm seeing is that with respect to cobalt, is that it's really starting to become a very minor cost saving overall. One of the interesting quotes I got from the day was an analyst pointed out that if you amortize the cost of the battery over the life cycle of the vehicle, it becomes about, in US terms, a penny a mile. That's roughly what the battery costs you. The tyres cost you 3 pennies a mile because it goes through tyres, because these are high torque. So I say that slightly tongue-in-cheek, but there's ultimately a limited end game of how much you're going to end up thrifting out of the battery when it costs you 3 times as much to put rubber on the road. And I think it's been said to me a number of times from some industry participants that the battery is actually starting to evolve and / mature in a lot of the ways. There's some interesting things happening on the anode side, but nevertheless, there's a maturing happening. And there will be a step change, but certainly not in the foreseeable future.